It's 70 years since the founding of Communist China, but protests in Hong Kong overshadow Beijing's message of national unity and power. Along with trade wars and territorial disputes, how will China manage these persistent challenges? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. The founder of modern China once said, "A single spark can start a prairie fire." While 70 years since Mao Zedong established the Communist People's Republic, China's modern-day leaders want to contain the sparks potentially threatening their hold on power. President Xi Jinping wore a traditional Mao suit to launch the celebrations with a large military parade in Beijing. She warned against threats to national unity and sent a message to semi-autonomous Hong Kong and the self-ruled island of Taiwan.
No power can shake our great motherland's position. No power can stop the progress of the People's Republic of China and the people of China. We must uphold a peaceful one country, two systems principle, safeguard Hong Kong, Macau's prosperity and stability, and promote a peaceful development of cross-strait relations, unite all the Chinese people, and continue to realize the complete reunification of the motherland.
Well, Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam was at the celebrations in Beijing, while in her home city, police were busy putting out fires in anti-China protests. One man was shot in the chest in the latest of 4 months of protests demanding change. The Hong Kong government toned down the National Day celebrations. Sarah Clark has more from Hong Kong.
There have been dramatic scenes across Hong Kong on October 1st, which is China's National Day. Tear gas has been used in every single rally location. And there were 6 different organised assemblies across Hong Kong and one massive march, which was a peaceful march, which attracted tens of thousands of people who moved from Causeway Bay through to central Hong Kong. The police have now confirmed that live bullets were used at 2 of those locations. And at the one location in Tsuen Wan, one particular person was hit at close range. But there have been other people hospitalised. The hospital authority says more than 15 people have gone to hospital with injuries after today's various assemblies and protests where police and protesters have clashed.
Now, Beijing has other problems too. The trade war between China and the US continues to damage the world's 2 largest economies. What's described as the repression and abuse of Uyghur Muslims in Western China is another major issue. Human Rights Watch estimates at least 1 million people are held in so-called re-education camps where they're forced to abandon their culture and praise the government. And China is also condemned for its territorial disputes with various countries bordering the South China Sea. China's created man-made islands and built military bases. Well, let's bring in our guests now for today's Inside Story. From Hong Kong, we have Jean-Pierre Cabestan, professor at Hong Kong Baptist University and author of China Tomorrow, Democracy or Dictatorship. And on Skype from Seoul, South Korea, Gordon Chang, political analyst and author of The Coming Collapse of China. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on Inside Story. Jean-Pierre Cabestan, let me start with you. To what extent have the rallies in Hong Kong spoiled Beijing's celebrations, and could Hong Kong be the single spark that starts the prairie fire for Beijing?
I think the protesters in Hong Kong succeeded in spoiling the show of the National Day of the People's Republic of China today. You had this huge parade in Beijing this morning, but what the international media are going to remember about today will be the violence in Hong Kong and the ongoing political crisis here, where many of the issues which have been raised by the protesters remain to be solved. And I think today, by the level of violence which has been reached on both sides, the protester side, but also on the police side, we've entered a new ball game where things are getting more complicated for, I think, Carrie Lam, the chief executive, to get out of the crisis.
Gordon Chang, in Seoul, you wrote in a recent article that China's Communist Party has little to celebrate and Chinese leaders are no longer in control of their destiny, you say. Why?
Well, what you've seen is in Hong Kong, they certainly don't control the streets anymore because we have what looks like open warfare, including what may be a fatal shooting of an 18-year-old, and that will trigger a new round of violence. You know, we have seen in prior history, going back a millennia, Chinese regimes have unraveled often from the outside in, including the last regime, the Qing dynasty. So, you know, right now, I think that Xi Jinping has got to be a little bit worried. You know, people in China are not sympathetic with the Hong Kong protesters, but they certainly could be inspired by them because people in Hong Kong have gotten something. They've gotten the permanent withdrawal of the extradition bill. And people on the mainland may say, well, I've got grievances as well. So I think it's going to be a very difficult time for Xi Jinping.
A difficult time, Gordon, you say, but interestingly, Beijing has let these protests in Hong Kong continue, and pro-Beijing supporters do have a point when they say that if mainland China really wanted to intervene and influence Hong Kong's affairs, then we wouldn't see these continuing protests in Hong Kong. It's been nearly 4 months now of these demonstrations. Why do you think China has been reluctant to intervene directly?
Yeah, I take a different view of this. Essentially, what you've got is China not being able to influence events. You know, they could, of course, bring in the military, but if they were to do that, I think they'd be in for years, if not decades, of essentially a guerrilla campaign. So they would be casualties that would be high on both sides. So I actually think that China right now is in a position where it realizes it can't influence what's going on in Hong Kong and is really just a bystander.
Well, let's bring in our third guest now from Beijing, who's just joined us on Skype, Einar Tangen, who's a China political analyst who advises the Chinese government on economic and development issues. Einar, thank you very much for being with us. President Xi Jinping said in his speech that there's no force that can shake the status of this great nation. I wonder what is going through the Chinese leadership's mind when on this significant day they see the chaos that's been going on the streets of Hong Kong?
Well, you'll notice that he referenced 1841, which was the beginning of the century of humiliation. That was when Great Britain actually forcibly seized Hong Kong as part of the spoils of the first Opium War. This is Great Britain's chance to be the great drug dealer to China. So this whole display, everything about it was to assure the people that the integrity of China was protected and that they would not be, in essence, vassals to a colonial power ever again. Now, in terms of my last colleague's statement, quite frankly, the reason that China is being very reserved is they know it's partially a trap. They feel very strongly that this is being instigated by forces, especially from the U.S., and that this is something where the U.S. wants China to go in there with an armed response with the PLA, so that it can be claimed that, yes, look, China is a brutal dictator. So they understand that this is the game that's being played, and they are trying their best to maintain distance and have faith in the one country, two systems.
Okay, Jean-Pierre Cabestan, your thoughts on that. Why do you think China hasn't intervened in Hong Kong? I mean, in 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre saw pro-democracy protesters killed in Tiananmen, and this, of course, plunged China into international isolation. Why do you think they've been more reluctant to step in this time?
I think because Hong Kong is not China. Hong Kong is a special place which was returned to China 22 years ago. Hong Kong political culture, dominant political culture, is very much democratic and is dominated by liberal values. Now, of course, you can accuse the British of having inculcated in the mind of the Hong Kong people liberal values, but that's the situation that it is. And I don't think that mainland China can convert the Hong Kong society to the one-party system. That's why you have this clash of values between Hong Kong society and mainland Chinese society. So vice versa, I don't think that Hong Kong at this stage can really influence mainland China. No spark is going to set the fire to the prairie in the coming years. But having said that, Xi Jinping's room for maneuver in Hong Kong is pretty narrow, because he wants on the one hand to keep the one country two system formula. He wants to keep it credible, not only for Hong Kong, but also for Taiwan tomorrow.
Right.
And he wants also to keep it credible because Hong Kong is still important as far as a financial place for Hong Kong, for Chinese economy and for Chinese credibility on the world stage. And I think that's very important for China not to rock the boat too much here. So there are options to get out of the crisis. One would be to change the CE, the chief executive, to ask Carrie Lam to leave and to appoint someone else. That will sort of actually help, if not putting an end to the crisis, at least lowering the temperature in Hong Kong.
Right.
The other concession that can be made, has been asked for many months and weeks by the protesters, is to set up an independent commission for inquiry about police brutality in Hong Kong.
Right.
But for the time being, as you know, the chief executive has refused to fulfill that demand.
Before we move on to other issues, let me bring in Gordon Chang and ask you, Gordon, what do you think China's options, Beijing's options in Hong Kong are right now? And do you think that the one China, two system policy is doomed?
Yeah, I think the system is doomed. It's just certainly not working. Chinese communists cannot leave well enough alone. There would be no protests if Beijing did not try to encroach on autonomy. And clearly, we've seen Xi Jinping's intrusive policies fail. I just don't see China having very many options, given the situation here. This is not going to be another Tiananmen where you had, a wide open environment where Chinese armor could kill at will. Hong Kong's very different. It's a dense urban landscape. It's got narrow roads and alleys. It's got high buildings, which are like forts. The casualties for China would be extremely high. And I don't think Xi Jinping really believes that he can sustain that. So I don't think there is a military option. Xi Jinping is not known for restraint, and so in general. So I don't see why he would be restrained in Hong Kong right now, especially considering the challenge to Chinese authority. Because the kids are saying on the streets, they want independence, and that would be anathema. You would think China would do something, and if it could do something, it would have done it.
All right, Einar Tangen in Beijing. Let's talk about Taiwan briefly. I know you want to respond to what you just heard from Gordon, and I'll let you do that. But on Taiwan, the goal of China has been to eventually reunify the two Taiwan straits. How achievable is that today in the current context?
Well, it's not politically, it's not very viable because you have people manufacturing these kinds of issues, which really have to do less with Beijing and more to do with the economy. And what I mean by that is in Taiwan, they have a stagnant economy. Also, in Hong Kong, which you in essence have, is the top 100 families have been using their position to enrich themselves while their fellow men and women get very little. The average person at the average wage in Hong Kong would have to work 28 years and not eat or sleep anywhere except their parents' house in order to afford one house, and a very modest one at that. So they've been able to restrict land values, to restrict building, and in essence drive the prices up. And this is what is really driving this. So all of these ideas about giving concessions and doing like this, you don't do that with a mob. They don't have a leadership. You can't negotiate. Every sign of weakness, as in pulling this extradition treaty off, only resulted in more mayhem. So with this kind of situation, this idea that this is democracy, the flower of democracy, is completely wrong. These people are throwing Molotov cocktails,
Gordon,
not at Chinese troops. They're throwing at their fellow countries.
Let's allow Gordon to respond, Einar. Gordon, go ahead. Your response to that.
We have seen in the beginning of this cycle, it's not the kids throwing Molotov cocktails. It was the excessive force of the use by the police. And indeed, the reason why the rough tactics of the protesters have not drawn criticism from the mass of Hong Kong society is because people across society are concerned about the police brutality. We've seen this today in some of those videos of the police beating females who are not protesting. They're lying prostrate on the ground, and police officers are hitting them with their truncheons. I mean, this is just something that we have seen day in, day out. And so, I don't know what's going through the minds of the young protesters, but clearly people do not want China to encroach on their autonomy. And so, yeah, call it democracy, call it whatever you want. But these people have legitimate grievances.
Okay. Gentlemen, let's move away from Hong Kong for a bit if we can, because there are other issues to explore here, of course, and one of them being the trade war between the US and China. Jean-Pierre Cabestan, where do things stand right now as China celebrates 70 years? You've got this trade war going on, and there's been a lot of talk about decoupling the world's two biggest economies. How much would that hurt China and the Communist Party leadership?
Well, we're still in the middle of this trade war, and as you know, negotiations are going to resume in October this month. Whether they will be able to yield some results remains to be seen. It's likely that we're going to reach some kind of partial agreement on some issues, but the fundamental issues which are opposing the US and China are still there, and I don't see both countries really reaching a deal across the board. So now the question is whether there will be a decoupling of both economies. I think the decoupling will remain partial because there are too many businesses and sectors of the economy of both sides which are interdependent. Of course, some of the production lines have already moved to other countries, Southeast Asia or South Asia, but there are a number of industries which you can't move overnight. So I think both economies will remain partially interdependent in the longer run. So, and that's something we have to bear in mind because that will have some, I think, impact on the negotiation and the way both sides can reach a deal.
Einar Tangen, do you agree with that? That both countries have to be interdependent to a certain extent, even though we've seen China recently trying to turn to other countries in Latin America, for instance, in Argentina. Is decoupling, this decoupling that's been mentioned a lot, is that something that China is seriously considering?
It's not a question of considering. Business and diplomacy is based on trust. Once the trust is lost and you cannot rely, you have to move elsewhere. I agree that during this investment cycle, the companies will try to run out whatever it is that they have invested and keep it there. But in terms of new investment, they're going to be looking for other places. I mean, you already see Huawei has announced that they can build their 5G radios without any tech, hardware, or software from the US. And you're going to continue to see those kind of developments. What's difficult to understand, though, is that the US will be walking away from about $500 billion a year in business. And that's business that will not be replaced. And by saying $500 billion, I mean the value of what American companies make in China and sell here, and also what they export back to the United States and what is imported back into China from the United States. So this is a very big number. There's no market to make it up.
Right.
So it's a little bit strange how this is going to turn out.
Gordon, in Seoul, Einar seems to think that the Americans will hurt more from this prolonged trade war with China than the Chinese will. Do you agree with that?
I certainly don't. Last year, China's merchandise trade surplus with the United States was 119.3% of its overall surplus. That's overwhelming dependence on the U.S. I mean, the overriding reality is the U.S. market. And also, America is not a trade-dependent economy, but China is much more trade-dependent. And by the way, we're the trade deficit country. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, says, we Americans should remember the lessons of the Great Depression and the trade war. Well, the lesson of the Great Depression is that trade surplus countries really get hurt in trade wars. We're not the trade surplus country. So, China has a lot to lose, much more than the United States does. We've got an economy which in reality is growing faster than China's. So, why should we worry?
Einar, your response to that?
I don't know which reality you're referring to, Gordon. As I last recall, China's above 6. The United States is hovering around 2 and going down. Let's take a look at the future. You start talking about, excuse me? you start talking about these
China's not
numbers,
growing at the
you're not
6.3%
supporting
pace
them.
that they.
You just say
first
in
half.
reality. What is
That's
your reality
absurd.
that you're talking about?
The reality is that China's growing maybe 1 or 2%, maybe even contracting, as that Renmin University professor mentioned last December. U.S. will grow about 2 to 3%, and we've got a larger economy, so the gap between the U.S. and China will grow. But China right now is
So
got
this
some
is your
really
feeling
serious
based
problems,
on
as you saw from
a
the
survey
August
of
and September
how
number.
you think things are going. I mean, Gordon, you're supposed to be a fairly well-respected economist with an idea about things. Generally, you would rely on some sort of set of data, not some sort of point made by a random professor that you choose to believe. I mean, if these numbers are incorrect, why isn't the IMF, the World Bank, and everybody else saying that this isn't true?
All right, gentlemen, this could go on for some time. Let's leave the trade war issue there and move on to human rights if we can. And I see that Jean-Pierre in Hong Kong perhaps wants to intervene here. Jean-Pierre, on the issue of human rights, last month the Chinese government issued a white paper on its progress in the field of human rights for the past 70 years. But really, what progress has there been on the human rights front for China in these last 70 years?
Okay, well, my first remark will be to say that there's a big difference between the first 30 years of the Chinese communist regime and the last 40 years. In the first 30 years, the human rights situation, as you know, deteriorated a lot because Mao Zedong, first of all, when he took power, he killed maybe 10 million Chinese, accusing them of being counter-revolutionaries. And then he decided to launch the Great Leap Forward, 40 million deaths, and then the Cultural Revolution, which caused the death of many more people and destroy the life of many families in China. Now, since the Deng Xiaoping launched the reforms in China, the situation of human rights has improved. Social economic rights have improved much better than political rights. And the big issue today is that China is sort of sticking to a very Soviet type of approach to human rights, saying that economic and social rights are more important than the political and civic rights, which is, of course, untrue.
Right.
And the problem today is whether China can respect human rights the way the international community understands human rights, meaning that you need both economic rights but also political rights. And then, as far as China is concerned, it is clear that there's still a long way to go for China to fulfill those rights. And I don't think that as long as you have a one-party system in China, it will be possible for China to accept having people who criticize the one-party system and who want to form another political party to move towards another political system.
Okay,
so as long as you have that system, those opponents will be suppressed and repressed.
Gordon, let me bring you in on this question of human rights. Jean-Pierre says there has been some progress, but there's still a long way to go. Your thoughts?
Well, there was progress starting with Deng Xiaoping, but under Xi Jinping, there's been a reversal. So, for instance, we've seen those concentration-like camps in both Xinjiang, in the northwest part of the country, and perhaps in Tibet as well, where you have, somewhere between 1.3 and 3 million people in facilities that remind us of the Third Reich before the mass exterminations. Also, you have this social credit system that is being put in place with consequences for people who are considered to be unfriendly or unreliable. So we're going back to a totalitarian system in China. It's, at first was slow, but it's starting to pick up. And so I think that if you're going to talk about phases, there should be the third phase, which is really a return to something that people just don't like.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for taking part in this discussion. Einar Tangen, Jean-Pierre Cabestan, and Gordon Chang. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation, of course, on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.